Rishabhanath is the first Tirthankara, right? But he must have lived, that is that if one takes the historical view, which there's no reason to, frankly, but he must have lived obviously 100,000, 200,000 years ago, because Neminath, the 22nd Tirthankara, is supposed to have lived 75,000 years ago. And the Adi Purana I was saying to you, and if you've heard this part, you let me know right away. But the Adi Puran, you think about the Puranas, right? That the Hindu Puranas that we have discussed a little bit. So Adi, the word Adi here means first. So this is a rhetorical device used by the poet to suggest that, oh, this is a work of great antiquity, because the older the work, the more venerable the work, right? And so the Adi Purana says, by birth are all men equal unto one another, but they differ in respect of the progress they might make on the spiritual path. Right? That by birth all of us are capable of achieving moksha in principle, but people's spiritual progress varies depending on how much karma they've accumulated and what they do to deflect this karma and what kind of life they lead. So that by birth are all men equal into one another, but they differ in respect of the progress they might make on the spiritual path. Meaning that everyone has it within them from birth to be able to achieve moksha, but the spiritual progress that people make varies enormously. And that depends on the extent to which they accumulate karma, the extent to which they can deflect karma by renouncing such things as possessions, giving up violence, etc. Right? But we will obviously investigate all of that at greater length. And then the Mahapuran, which, as this slide shows, of which the Adi Puran is a part, along with the Uttara Puran, says that some foolish men declare that a creator made the world. So you see, this goes back to the point I was making, that the Jain view is that their religion is eternal. It's always been there. There is no account of creation. Jainism does not have an account of creation. Much like Buddhism did not have an account of creation. You find the Rig Veda speaking about creation, but if you remember that wonderful hymn to creation, there's this extraordinary amount of ambiguity whether we can really speak about it. So it's very different than the Semitic view, than the view of Christianity and the Abrahamic faiths, right? Where you think about a creator. In Jainism, you don't really think about a creator. Some foolish men declare that a creator made the world. The doctrine that the world was created is ill-advised and should be rejected. If God created the world, where was he before creation? Right? Because then, of course, the question may arise, who created God? How could God have made the world without any raw material? If you say he made this first and then the world, you're faced with an endless regression. It's an infinite cycle, right? So this gives us a little hint about what Jainism is thinking about creation. But what I want you to keep in mind is that if someone takes this text and says, this shows that Rishabhanath was a historical person, it doesn't show that at all. Remember that this text is a 9th century text. It purports to give you the life of Rishabhanath, but this life cannot be cast in what you would call a historical chronology, not even remotely. So I think that it is very important to remember, I'm suggesting, right, that this is a much later text that we're really looking at, right, which is now looking back and then trying to construct something of a narrative. All right, now from Rishabhanath, who's the first Tirthankara, and the word Tirtha is important to remember here. important to understand. It's a place of pilgrimage, a ford, a shallow crossing point in a river or stream. That's what the word tirtha means. So a tirthankara is someone who helps one cross the sea of samsara. That's what these tirthankaras are. They basically help you cross this world of samsara. What is samsara? Samsara is the eternal cycle of birth, rebirth, reincarnation. And it is only those who achieve moksha or nirvana, a Buddha or a Mahavira, or some other very enlightened persons who escape that constant cycle, right? So that's what a Tirthankara is said to do. You can, in that sense, you can think of a Tirthankara as a little bit like an avatar, because the question to ask is, what purpose were the Buddha and Mahavir serving in the world? The purpose they were serving was to help the rest of humanity, right? To cross that sea of constant reincarnation, of cycle of births and deaths. And then the rest of the slide, I'm just giving you a little bit of the, a list of some of the Tirthankaras. What is interesting is that Rishabh is also mentioned as an incarnation of Vishnu in the Bhagavad Puran. And you remember I mentioned to you that there are 10 avatars, right? And in some of the Puranic literature, he appears in that list of 10. So you might say, what was happening here? What was happening here was that the Hindus who wrote the Bhagavad Puran, or the Vaishnavites, because that's what they were Vaishnavas, they were trying to deflate Jainism, make it less important by suggesting that the first Tirthankara was simply actually an incarnation of Vishnu. But this is what religions do. They each tries to minimize the other religion to some degree, because that's why I notice there that Indra appears in Jain narratives as a devotee of the Jinas, and Indra, of course, is a Vedic god. He is the chief of the gods. But some of the Jain narratives simply suggest that he was actually a devotee of the Jinas, the Tirthankaras, right? So Rishabhanatha is said to have been born according to the Adi Puran in Ayodhya. Once again, we get back to Ayodhya here. And this suggests to us that when you have a holy city, that even other founders of other religions or great eminent religious personalities of other faiths also sometimes will claim that city as their own. Or the city, it can claim people of different faiths, because there's something special about the aura of that city, because otherwise you think to yourself, it's too much of an accident, too much coincidence here that he was also said to have been born in Ayodhya. And when we look at the hagiographies, so the rest of that little portion there is really quite unimportant, but just there for your information. When we look at the hagiographies, we'll find that there's a particular pattern. Now, what do I mean by hagiography? Hagiography is a biography, but it's a biography of a saint. And I would go so far as to say that it doesn't matter what religion you're speaking about, religious hagiographies very often share similar features. If you look at Christian hagiographies, you look at Buddhist hagiographies, you look at Jaina hagiographies, right? That in all of these faiths and every other faith, the supposition is that the great renouncer, the great hero, the founder of the religion, that something, there's some omen that this person is going to come about. The mother has a dream when the hero is still in her womb, right? This was the case with the Buddha. We know that when Christ was born, there was Herod had been told that a child will be born, and when he is born, he is going to be the creator of a new kingdom, And so Herod orders all the babies to be killed, the massacre of the innocents. Right? So there's similar patterns. Now, when you look at Jaina hagiographies, that is the lives of the Jinas, the conquerors, or the Tirthankaras, they all the hagiographies have something in common. All the Jaina hagiographies, that each of these Jinas, so you get a short biography of all of them, and the most detailed, of course, is Mahavira by far, and then Parshavanatha you get a fair bit, and then the others you only get very small accounts. But these hagiographies all tell you that Jina's mother had auspicious dreams that she would be giving birth to a Jina, a conqueror. Jina is born into a Kshatriya family. So uh, here we have a little complication, as we'll see. But in general, each Jina is born into a Kshatriya family, so the warrior caste, right? Jina is going to renounce life, become an ascetic, achieves Kevala. Kevala is omniscience or moksha. And Jina is going to then preach to the animals, humans, and gods. Jina reestablishes the fourfold community of monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. This fourfold notion of the fourfold community is very important in Jainism. But just like the religion is eternal, the fourfold community has always been there. It's always been divided into four parts. Right? And the hagiographies make that very clear. And then upon death, each Jina achieves moksha and floats to the top of the universe, where he joins other liberated souls, and so therefore never has to be reborn. Right? That's the nature of this hagiography. And what is a hagiography? Once again, it's a biography, but it's a biography of a saint with certain very predictable features. Now, if you look at Mahavira, and that's why I put biography in quotation marks. Right? So, since Mahavira was born, this suggests that he had accumulated certain karma and therefore had to be reborn. Right? So that when he is reborn as Mahavira, it is at the end of that life that he is going to enter the Siddhalok. Siddhalok is the world, lok or loka, the world of those who have become the enlightened ones. Right? But in previous lives, because if there is samsara, that is that there is a cycle of birth and rebirth, birth, death, rebirth. Right? Birth and rebirth really is how one should put it, because there's really no death as such. There's birth and there's rebirth. Then it means that he had accumulated a certain amount of karma. Right? Now he's born as Vardhaman. The word means one who increases prosperity. His father was a minor ruler of a Kshatriya caste. And the rest of the hagiography or biography diverges according to whether you look at the Svetambara or the Digambara traditions. And so what I've done here is I've also given some of the alternative versions here, the Digambara version, although up till this point, what I'm going to say now, the two are the same, and then they begin to diverge, although sometimes even this point here is actually disputed by the Digambaras. But according to the more generally accepted version of his biography, he is transferred from the womb of Devananda, who was a Brahmin woman, to the womb of a Kshatriya woman by the name of Trishala. Okay, by none other than Indra himself. And remember that Indra is spoken of, even though he is the chief of the Vedic gods. He is someone who is spoken of as someone who was a devotee of the Jinas, right? So he's a patron of the Jain faith. And why did Indra have his why did he transfer Mahavir when he was still in his mother's womb to the womb of another woman? Because he had to be born into the great glorious caste of the Kshatriyas, not the Brahmins. So in other words, there is a critique here, an implicit critique of Brahminism. Now the Svetambaras say that he married Yashoda and he had a daughter by the name of Priyadarshana. Digambaras say that he never married. While he was in the womb, Mahavir did not move around according to these hagiographies. So I'm picking out some of the key elements of these hagiographies. Because what are these hagiographies doing? They're saying that even when he was in the womb, he had already come to the awareness of some of the central ideas of Jainism. One of those central ideas being the idea of Ahimsa, all right, non-violence. And so they say that while he was in the mother's womb, he did not move around. You know how a baby kicks in its mother's stomach, right? But that he didn't move around, because if he moved around, it would cause his mother discomfort. And discomfort is a form of himsa or violence. Similarly, he did not renounce until his parents had passed away, so as not to cause them any distress. But the Digambaras strongly disagree with that reading. They say actually that he took the permission of his brother, who was then the king, okay? Who was then the king. He took his brother's permission. Some Digambara texts suggest that he took the permission of his parents before he became a renouncer. And then upon renunciation, Mahavir gives away his wealth and he pulls his hair out in 5 handfuls. So he pulls out 5 clumps of hair. And this is one of the things that a sadhu or a muni or a maharaj, all 3 of these are terms for a monk who has renounced life, a Jain monk. Pulling out hair, but whether you pull it out 2 times or 6 times, this depends on which text you're looking at, but you pull it out, this all goes back to what Mahavir is thought to have done. And then when Mahavir had renounced, and we'll see exactly what that entailed, we'll look at one paragraph from a text, the people celebrated his renunciation with great pomp and joy. This here is an image. It's not a very good image, but you can see it, right? A little bit, at least.
Yeah.
So this is from the Kalpasutra. The Kalpasutra. This is from a palm leaf manuscript. If I'm not mistaken, I think the original is now in the collection of the University of Chicago Library. This is from the 14th century, and here it shows Mahavir or Vardhaman's mother. This is him as an infant with his mother. All right. There are obviously Jaina manuscripts, and there are fantastic books that have been published where you can look at some of these manuscripts and these drawings. And as with all these manuscripts that you have, again, with Hinduism as well, Vaishnava manuscript, Shaivite, Bhagavad Purana, you would never find this painting by itself. There would always be a text accompanying it. Always a text accompanying it, or rather you should say the painting accompanies the text. So how is Mahavir's renunciation described? And this is how it's described in chapter 6 of the Kalpasutra. Right? So I've given you the exact citation. I'll make this available to you as well, this PowerPoint, and I'll also make available the English translation of this to you. The first known translation of this into English of this text in 1818. There's a PDF of it. So he says, while the venerable ascetic Mahavir was yet living in the society of men and following the religious practice of a householder, this would suggest that he was married. That's what this would suggest, because he's a householder. He had obtained incomparable, all-manifesting, indestructible intelligence and perception, that even though he was a householder, he was already a man of extraordinary perception, wisdom, omniscience. Therefore, by this incomparable, all-manifesting, all-knowing intelligence and perception, clearly seeing that the time of his initiation had arrived. So now he knows that he needs to renounce. He needs to be initiation, meaning initiation into some other order, or initiated into a new phase of life. He abandoned in fixed resolve. He never had any uncertainty, no doubt in his mind. He abandoned in fixed resolve all his silver, abandoned all his gold, his wealth, kingdom, country, army, chariots, treasury, storehouses, city, private apartments, and society. Right? You see, this is where the text has become, if I may put it this way, it's predictable. It's like the sentences are there, you just stick them into it. Because there'll be 100 texts which will use exactly the same language. And always, it's like the Buddha. He gave up everything. He gave up his kingdom. You know, he was decked in jewels, diamonds. Right? This is the exaggeration of the text, because it's showing that there was all this massive wealth, and effortlessly, without any doubt in his mind, he just gives it up. He has no attachment to it. Right? He abandoned in fixed resolve. And taking his money, golden ornaments, jewels, precious stones, pearls, conches, corals, rubies, and other precious stones, he distributed them in charity and divided them among his relations. So he gives it all away in charity. He gives some to family members. Right? This is from the Kalpasutra. And then after he's done it, what does he do? The adorable ascetic Mahavira, so the text describes these two adjectives, adorable ascetic, this is part of the description of Mahavira, for 12 years and full 6 months. That means 12 and a half years. Right? Entirely neglected his body and laid aside all care of his persons. And with whatever things he was brought in contact, whether goods, men, or other animals, whether pleasing or displeasing, he conducted himself with perfect patience and equanimity, and felt nothing dispirited by the wretchedness of his condition. Now, some of the other texts tell you what this means is that he subjected himself to considerable austerities. And this is where the Buddha departs from him. Because the Buddha also subjects himself to austerities, but the Buddha is going to come to an awareness that you cannot get very far with these austerities. So therefore, the Buddha is going to preach what is called the middle path, madhyamika, the middle path. Don't tend towards the extremes. The adorable ascetic Mahavira was houseless. Let's think about each of these, houseless. And you will see the significance of each of these in turn. Because to be houseless means to have no permanent abode, a wanderer, someone who is moving around constantly, a speaker of the truth, dedicated to satya, eating only what had no fault, meaning eating only that which was given to him, and given to him by people who admired him and who in turn had done the most they could to ensure that what they gave him had not entailed more than the necessary loss of life. There is some loss of life because when you pluck a plant, there's some loss of life there, but that's unavoidable. Okay? Anything beyond that is owing to our fault. So that's what the text means when it says only what had no fault, having no vessel either to receive presents or to make oblations. To make oblations means offerings to the gods, or to receive anything, right? He didn't have anything with him. On finishing the rest of the rainy season, the venerable ascetic Mahavira traveled 8 months. Notice 8 months, not 12 months, right? Why 8 months? Because during the rainy season, that is the 4 months of the rainy season, the Jains do not move around. The Jain renouncer doesn't move around. or moves around less so. Why? Because during the rainy season, all the insects come out. And therefore, there is a greater possibility that you will tread on them. You will accidentally end up killing one of them, walking on them, for example. But in the remaining 8 months, you move around during hot and cold weather, right? Remaining a night at a village and 5 in a city, esteeming the dust of well-flavored wood and of ill-flavored wood and of sandalwood the same. That is, that wood that is rotting and sandalwood, the dust of these is the same to someone like the Mahavira. Looking at grass and pearls, gold and a clod of earth, pleasure and pain as all alike. So whether it's grass, whether it's mud on the one hand, or whether it's pearls or gold, it's the same to Mahavira. Bound neither to this world nor to the world to come, desiring neither life nor death, wholly superior to worldly attachments, setting himself to slay the enemy works. Enemy works here meaning action, okay, doing things. This is what the text says about what the significance of his renunciation was, how he conducted himself. And much of what Jain renouncers will do is described here. Being houseless, a wanderer, a speaker of the truth, each of which we will look at in slightly greater detail as we move along. All right. Now, this is the Kalpasutra translation. This is, of course, not the text in Sanskrit. The Kalpasutra would be approximately, I think, about 1600 years, maybe, right? But this is the English translation, and this is the cover of the English translation. I know it's not very clear here, but this is published in 1818 in London and translated by Reverend J. Stevenson. And the translations I've taken are from there. There are more modern translations, but sometimes it's advantageous to use a translation going back then because it tells you a little bit about how the religion was being received in the West. Because the translation is done, of course, for people living in the West, for people living in England, and to some degree in other English-speaking places like the United States. So what are some of the Jain texts? We'll just consider two very briefly. So one of them is the Kalpasutra, which I've mentioned, attributed to a man called Bhadra Bahu, who lived around 300 BCE. He is the person who was Chandragupta Maurya's mentor or guru. And the Digambaras say that he established a community in South India at the place I'd mentioned, Shravanbelagol. All right, there's a little typo over here. Shravan, it should be B, Shravanbelagol. The Svetambaras, however, claim that he went north to Nepal. All right, so there's a divergence there as well. What is the text? It contains the biographies of the Tirthankaras. So that, for example, that biography that I mentioned of Rishabhanatha, although that was from a different text called the Adi Puran, but it contains very brief biographies of the Tirthankaras, which, again, the word biography is not really instructive because you cannot establish the historicity of those Tirthankaras at all. And I think there's almost no Jain scholar that I know of who will suggest that these were historical figures, all right, or that we can establish their historicity, barring Parshavanatha and Mahavira. So it contains the biographies of the Tirthankaras, but especially those of Parshavanatha, the 23rd Tirthankara, and then Mahavira, and was first committed to writing around 980 years after the death of Mahavira. So that's why I said about 1500 years old, right? Roughly. Because if Mahavira died about 527, then we can say that this text was composed somewhere around 470, 500, somewhere around that time, all right? The other, and we look at one or two portions of it. The other text that I want you to keep in mind is the Tattva Artha Sutra. Sutra, the word sutra means that the works are written as a series of aphorisms. So it's in verse usually, and is written as aphorisms. So this work is likewise viewed as a very venerable work by all Jains. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Shvetambara or the Tirthapanthi or a Digambara, all the branches of Jains view this as a very venerable work. It's attributed to an Acharya. Acharya is a learned man who is said to have lived from somewhere between the 2nd century and 5th century CE. I think Indian scholars place him in the 2nd century CE. Western scholars tend to place him a little bit later, more closer to the 5th century CE. And this author's name is Umaswati. He wrote this work in Sanskrit, and he's also viewed quite favorably by the Hindus because he wrote a number of other works, and there's some overlap between what he writes, in the Tattva Artha Sutra and some of the other writings of his, which are a bit closer in spirit to Hindu literature. And here is its opening. Very important. Very important, okay? Because this is where you see a clear, explicit statement of the three jewels. The right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct constitute the path to liberation. This is in the very first verse of the first book of this text. Right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct constitute the path to liberation. The Tattva Artha Sutra offers you the basics of Jain theology. Now, this we're going to look at in considerable detail, all right? So it's going to take, if you have any questions, ask me, but you may want to wait until I give you a few more slides because then you'll see the more elaborate explanation. So the basics of Jain theology are one, that the view that souls exist. And incidentally, this is where immediately there is a difference with the Buddhist view. So that even though Buddhism and Jainism are both viewed together as Shramanic religions, which differed from Hinduism, moved away from Hinduism, the Buddha doesn't speak about the soul. There are texts where he even denies there's a soul, but sometimes you can, on some other readings, you can say he's ambivalent about it because he tells you, yes, there is suffering, but he never refers to something metaphysical called the soul. Buddhism in that sense resolutely moves away from that kind of metaphysics, all right? And this is where, of course, you could say that Jainism was closer to Hinduism in speaking about the soul. So souls exist, but and soul means jiva. And then there is also non-sentient matter, which is called ajiva. So remember the ajivikas, the materialist school, all right? That word ajivika is from ajiva, non-sentient, non-living matter, right? Then thirdly, there are karmic principles exist that inflow to each soul. So what happens is that there are karmic principles, or particles rather, that get attached to us, okay? And that's where you see number 4, if you take ashrava and bandha as in the common Hindi word bandhan, meaning to put together, unka bandhan hua, meeting. These karmic particles, what are these karmic particles? These karmic particles can be caused, for example, by passions. This is the material that you inherit from your previous life. They bind to the soul, which transmigrate with rebirth. That is, that in your next life, some of these will carry on, right? And then what you have to do is you have to find ways to stop these karmic particles from getting attached to you, from flowing into you and from getting attached to you. And the strategies, not quite the word we want to think about, but I'm using it for the sake of convenience, or the practices, all right? The practices, the conduct, the knowledge, that you exercise to wean these karmic particles away from the soul so that it can get liberated, those are encompassed under what is called nirjara. And then if you have been able to free yourself from all of these karmic particles, which will happen but rarely, very rarely, only to a few enlightened ones, only then, if you are able to release yourself away from all these, can you achieve moksha. The Buddhist word, of course, would be nirvana, liberation from worldly bondage. We'll get into that, but for a moment, first, because we'll see that there are going to be some doctrinal differences. So therefore, between the Svetambaras and Digambaras, and since I've mentioned them before, now it's worthwhile to just pause and see how this schism happened. Okay, there are a number of accounts, and there are two or three things that are important in that account. Very basic things that are important to why the Svetambaras, why there was a schism, and one part became known as the Svetambaras, and the other became known as the Digambaras. So this schism was taking place over a period of at least 2 centuries before it became firm at what was called the Council of Vallabhi or Vallabhi, which is in Saurashtra in Gujarat, in the middle part of the 5th century CE, so somewhere around 450 of the Common Era. This schism took place over the question of aparigraha. Aparigraha is non-possession, and in particular on the use of clothes. All right. So let's just translate this. I mean, it's simple enough, the language, but we still have to understand what exactly the dispute was about. The question was, when Mahavira renounced, did he renounce all clothes as well or not? Because if severe austerities demand the renunciation of everything, should clothes not be renounced as well? Right? That is the fundamental question. Now, let's remember that, but move into a related tangent, which is that if all clothes have to be renounced, what about women? And of course, you could ask yourself, well, why should it be any different? Why, if men can go around naked, renouncers, because remember, this is for renouncers. This is not for lay people. This is only for those who have taken initiation into the monastic order, who have become monks. And the equivalent for women would be becoming nuns, right? To use the Western translation. So if you're using the terms of our culture, Sanskritic terms, the sadhu or the muni, and for the women, they would be sadhvis, right? So why cannot women go around naked? And one reason they can't go around naked is because of their physiology. Right? So that would be the simplest view. And you might say, well, what about their physiology? Well, the problem is that their going around naked opens them to sexual attack. Of course, that's not a problem for the woman as such. But it becomes a problem because then she gets entangled in something that she cannot be entangled into if she wants to achieve moksha. All right. So a separate question arose, which is it possible for women to actually attain moksha or not? And the Digambara view was then and still is that women cannot attain moksha. They cannot attain moksha. They have to be reborn as men before they can attain moksha. Okay, that's the Digambara view. So, in other words, now what was the schism? There were those who said limited amount of clothing is permissible, all right, and they are called the Svetambaras, from the Sanskrit word Shweta or Sveta, which means pure or white. So the Svetambaras are those who are clad in in white, in clean clothes, and white is a color of purity, and those who go without any clothes at all. The Munis, the Digambara Munis, sadhus who go about completely naked, regardless of the weather, the time of the year, they are only clad, they are only covered by the sky. They're called the sky clad, the Digambaras. Right? But you see, it was not simply a dispute over women and whether they can attain moksha or not. And the clothing question itself was a subset of the question of how to interpret aparigraha, that is non-possession. Because once you have clothes, well, you're possessing something, and then of course from there you may then move on to other things, you know. Now, if you're looking at the geographical distribution, we find that the Digambaras are more common in Western and Central India, so in Gujarat and in Maharashtra among the renouncers. And here we're speaking really about the renouncers, although then we find that there are other doctrinal differences for lay people too, sometimes between the Digambaras and Svetambaras. The one thing that we have to bear in mind is that in Jainism, even though there is a very clear distinction between the renouncer and the lay persons, the relationship between the two is much closer than it is between monks and lay people in other religions, for reasons that are hinted at in Mahavira's renunciation, and which I'm going to look at explicitly. But if you're looking at the demographic composition, then this is how it is. Digambaras more in Western and Central India, Svetambaras more in the North and Northwest. And then there are further subdivisions that happen over a period of time. That's when you get into a lot of detail, which we can't really get into and which is really not necessary. But some of this has to do with some subgroups like to worship with images. And when we say images, we mean images of the Jinas or the Tirthankaras. And some like to worship without the images. Some worship with the scriptures. And some want to worship inside temples with the images. Some will worship inside the temple only with scriptures. All right, and there are also, if you can see the slide, right? The last slide, yeah. So there are also differences between those subgroups where women who have achieved a certain degree of enlightenment, there are different stages of that which are mentioned. But women who have achieved advanced state of enlightenment, whether they can preach to men and whether they have access to all the Jaina scriptures, and some of them allow that and some don't. So this is part of a larger question, which is now taking place in some Jain communities. I don't think it's taking place in all Jain communities, but I think in some Jain communities, there's a discussion taking place about whether Jainism is, like other religions, patriarchal. That is, that it tends to not just favor men, but that men are the template, that everything revolves, the theological doctrines revolve around men and what they do, and women are sort of incidental. You know, there's some discussion going on, because some people have taken the contrary view that Jainism is much less patriarchal. It has nuns, for example. But then again, as we are seeing, some Jain women are not allowed access, even those who are enlightened, to Jaina scriptures or to some of the Jaina scriptures. And then, of course, in the Digambara view, women cannot actually attain moksha. A woman cannot, because the Digambaras say that you have to go about entirely naked, and women cannot go about entirely naked. All right. We took a brief look at Jain theology, but I want to take a little more extended view of that, few more minutes on that. So Jain theology, which as I've encapsulated here, is that all living beings have innately perfect souls, jivas, which are endowed with these divine qualities of infinite bliss, infinite knowledge, infinite perception, infinite Shakti, right? All living beings have that. However, of course, we're going to see that there's karmic material that is attached. Purifying the soul of all karma. So what is karma here? Karma here is the fruits, as it were, the residue of all your previous lives and all your actions, right? So if you do something bad, people will colloquially say, it's going to produce bad karma, okay? So purifying the soul of all of this karma and therefore experiencing the infinite qualities of the soul, that is the Atman, is the way to achieve freedom from rebirth. And as I've indicated, the Buddha doesn't speak of the soul. That's one difference. What does he say? He says that you have to be awakened to the nature of reality, right? Remember the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering, right? And this suffering, there is a reason for that. The reason for that is desire, right? And so therefore we have to work towards the extinction of this, because if there is suffering and it has a cause, then there's also a remedy to that cause. And then he'll give you the eightfold path after that, right? But there's no description of the soul here, unlike in Jainism or in Hinduism. For Jains, karma is the microscopic particles of matter that float around in the universe. This is describing in a philosophical sense, in a metaphysical sense. They stick to the soul and may fall from the soul. How would they fall from the soul? If you partake of right conduct, right faith, and right knowledge. Right? And then we'll see what all these three mean in turn. So, and passions would include such things as anger, desire, envy, greed. All of these are going to bind these karmic particles to the soul. So the soul has to be liberated from these, right? So Jain soteriology meaning that branch which deals with liberation, that branch of theology which deals with the idea of liberation, developed around this conception of karma and is designed both to stop the influx of new harmful karma. If you continue to engage in bad conduct, you accumulate new karma, and also to eliminate. So it has to do both, right? That if you're going to achieve liberation, you have to work to eliminate the karmic particles that are already there, and you have to act in such a way as to prevent the influx of new karmic material, samvara. So while Buddhism was called the middle way, I'm giving you a little comparison there because the Buddha rejected the extremes of luxury and austerity. Jainism advocated difficult austerities in order to purify the soul of karma. That is that both samvara, stopping the influx of this karmic material, and nirjara, eliminating this, both of them actually require considerable amount of austerities. So what is nirjara, right? Nirjara, if you go back to this slide, is eliminating the karmic particles that have already been accumulated. It means that you must work to eliminate the passions, anger, pride, greed, deceit, right? Because otherwise it leads to accumulation of this karmic material. And nirjara therefore necessitates the tapas, or the practice of austerities, which are in Jain texts described as 12, principally divided into two categories of 6 internal and 6 external austerities. So the 6 internal austerities are humility, penance, service, religious study, meditation, and renunciation. And the 6 external austerities, you'll notice that they're all very closely related because they all have to do with the body, with the pleasures of the flesh, right? Are fasting, reduced diet or semi-fasting, restricting the varieties of food, right? Limiting one's pleasure of food in food. So varieties of food, take a very colloquial example that you have dinner and you have your cook, your bawarchi, prepare 10 different dishes. Well, all right. as opposed to limiting one's pleasure in food, meaning, you don't, it means having simple food, not having food that, you take real pleasure from because it's been prepared with extraordinary spices or is an unusual dish, etc. Learning to live in solitude and subduing bodily desires. And these are and I've given a source here as well. One of the sources for this is a text called, the text that we've looked at before when I was talking about the two texts, the Tattva Artha Sutra. So now Jainism, I mean, I could have first given you the 5 Mahavrats, but I'm going straight to Ahimsa and then I'll get to it. So I may not be proceeding what you might think is the logical sequence here, but I'm moving to Ahimsa because I think that I would be correct in saying, I'm almost certain that if you had to think about the one thing that Jainism is associated with in the minds of most people, it's the idea of Ahimsa, or nonviolence. And what is mentioned in the Mahabharata is also mentioned in the Jain texts. Ahimsa parmo dharam. Ahimsa, nonviolence, parmo, greatest dharam. It's the highest dharma. It's the highest ethical law, ethical duty. Now, I could go on forever about the question of nonviolence. So we had a whole 2 sessions on Gandhi. But, we have to remember that there is something else happening here as well within the Jain faith. And so we're going to have to take a different view than when we do in the case of Gandhi, partly because there it's in a domain that, at least in the imagination of most people, gets translated into the political sphere. That is, that most people think of Gandhi as the architect of the idea of mass nonviolent resistance, right? And I think that for many people, Ahimsa is also associated mainly with vegetarianism. First and foremost, vegetarianism. Now, the Jain view is far more complex, but that also means that it's more open to criticism and critique in many ways. Non-violence means, in the first instance, if you did a common sense kind of reading, it means abstention from killing, injury. And one of the difficulties, of course, with the word non-violence, as opposed to the word ahimsa. So let's go back to the word ahimsa. The Sanskrit word is himsa, violence, and then you add the negation, all right? So non-violence. But that prefix non does not have the same load in India as it has here. What do I mean by that? I mean by that in the West, I want to argue non is negative, always, right? And I think there's a dread of the negative. People dread the negative. If you say something and it's a little pessimistic, people will always say, why are you so negative all the time? Of course, I always ask, what's the problem with being negative? What is this whole idea of being positive? I mean, the sun doesn't shine every day, and it doesn't shine on everyone equally either. So what one is working with is this liability that when you translate it into English, you have this heavy load. So you can imagine how difficult the task was for Gandhi. How does he make the idea of non-violence, a term that begins with the negative, attractive to people who have a fear of the negative, who want to run away from it as far as they can? I mean, everything in modern Western culture, particularly the United States, there's absolutely no tolerance for the idea of the negative whatsoever. Right? Now, you might say, well, isn't that the same problem with the Sanskrit word? And I want to suggest, no, it's not. I don't think that ahimsa has that same negative load, even though ahimsa. It's the negation of violence, right? Even though there is a negative there too, because I don't think the negative works in Indian philosophy the same way. You see, that's why. All right. And this is one reason why when the early European contact with Jaina philosophy, they were very critical. So that Kalpasutra translation, if you read the preface, you get a little idea of what's going on. And notice who it's done by. It's done by Reverend Stevenson. Reverend, he was a minister of the Christian church. See, so the Christians developed a critique of nonviolence because they said there is a negative ethic, but no positive ethic. You're told not to engage in violence, but you're not told what to do positively. And of course, for some Christians, the problem was that no Jaina thinker or teacher could provide the saving grace that Jesus could. All right. Now, when we think about ahimsa, we also have to make a distinction between necessary and unnecessary killing, because some killing is unavoidable, such as when you uproot plants. If you say that plants have life, which they do, you water them, they come back, right? But some amount of killing appears to be necessary in order for human beings to survive. So is it the case that what Jainism was seeking to do was to shelter the monks by having lay people assume more of that killing? Right? That's the question, one of the questions that we're going to ask, because we know that the injunction to preserve ahimsa is extraordinarily strong among the renouncers, to the extent that, you know, the Jain monk has his mupati. Mupati is a mouth covering, right? Mu is the mouth, right? Pati is a covering, to prevent the accidental swallowing of tiny living creatures. It also restrains the monk from unnecessary speech. Most people don't think of that, because talking too much or talking nonsense or saying things that are false are all forms of violence. So that mupati is something that is designed to make the monk be a practitioner of ahimsa in the extreme, in more than the ordinary sense of the term, and not just the accidental swallowing of tiny living creatures, but being pure in speech as well. Right? Now, there is if we wanted to understand ahimsa in the Jain framework, you notice that this is not what I was doing when I was looking at Gandhi, what I'm doing here, right? In the Jain framework, what is ahimsa designed to do? Keep in mind all the observations I've made about Jain theology. What is it intended to do? It's intended to ensure that you work towards eliminating the accumulated karmic particles that have attached to your soul and preventing the influx of new ones, right? So therefore, we can say that ahimsa is in fact actually designed to prevent the buildup of karma, and therefore to help one break this cycle of samsara, birth, rebirth, because that alone will enable us to work towards moksha, right? But of course, this begs the question, isn't one's journey on earth a form of ahimsa and violence, the very fact by which you are born, okay? That violence starts at that very moment. And I think that actually the extreme Jain view would say that, all right? So the suggestion here is that if we read the Jain conception of ahimsa and within this framework, that this extreme withdrawal from the world is one way to shelter oneself from the karma that ensues while being in the world. Because if you're in this world, some form of violence is almost invariable. And this is one reason why the Jain monk has to be completely sheltered from it. And we'll see a few particulars of that in just a few moments now. So this is very interesting. You know, we're living in the time of quarantine. And there's a scholar of Jainism, James Laidlaw, who's written a book called Riches and Renunciation, Religion, Economy, and Society Among the Jains, who describes in this book what he calls an ethic of quarantine. He says that the Jain belief is an ethic of quarantine. That is, you isolate the monk because you know that it's not possible to stop the cycle of death and rebirth, right? All one can do is temporarily keep it at bay, and this is what boiling water or covering one's head with a blanket does. You know what he's referring to boiling water here is that the Jain monk, even the water that he receives should be boiled. All right, it should be boiled so that there are no living particles in it, which might be almost invisible to the eye, but which are breathing particles which he takes in. These practices, which are central pillars of nonviolence in Jainism, function neither to minimize deaths nor in the normal sense to save life. I mean, so you see, he's actually offering a little bit of an incipient critique where he's saying that this severe kind of regime of austerities is not what we understand by nonviolence when we say that it's a way of saving life or preventing the loss of life. But of course, there is a kind of a anthropomorphic view here that he has, this author, by which I mean that he has elevated the humans over everyone else. Because when he says its function is not to minimize deaths, he means human deaths, right? And that's exactly what Jain thinkers are and renouncers are contesting. So actually insulating it's like putting the renouncer in quarantine. You see, the question for him is, I think this was a question for Gandhi too. Why didn't Gandhi become a renouncer? That reason he didn't become a renouncer, you could say it had to do with personal ambition. I think that would be much too simple. The reason he didn't become a renouncer is because he said the only way to be ethical now in our times is to be in this world, to move around, to do what people do, and then see if you can stop yourself from being violent. If someone says something to you, if the renouncer, all the renouncer is doing is cutting himself entirely, all right, except in limited contacts with the laity, which we'll see, but is not supposed to stay in one place, supposed to be moving around, is not supposed to possess anything, is not supposed to engage in speech. Right? The person is not partaking of life in the ordinary sense of what we mean by life. And so the critique here is that this form of renunciation, this form of nonviolence is maybe doing him good. Is it doing others good? Right? That's the critique. And I'm not necessarily taking up my own position here, but I'm saying that I think that Gandhi also was someone who took the view. So I think in that sense, I think he actually moved away from the view of the Jain renouncer, certainly, was that the only way you can actually really be completely ethical is to be in this world all the time and yet be completely detached from it, right? So now, I had mentioned the three jewels, all right? The three jewels: the right faith, right conduct, and right knowledge, which are mentioned in Jainism. Right faith means spiritual awakening. Right conduct means the adoption of Jain practices and leading an ethical life, and right knowledge means omniscience. Buddhism has these are called, by the way, the Ratnatraya, the three jewels. Ratna means jewel, right? Traya is three. So Buddhism has the three jewels too, which are the Buddha, the Dharma, that is the teachings, and the Sangha, the community. But the Jainism's three jewels are right faith, right conduct, and right knowledge. And here I want to show you, because now we get into Jain cosmology, I want to show you, this is a 16th century Gujarati painting. It's from a private collection in Switzerland, reprinted in a book called The History of Cartography. And we won't spend too much time on it, but because we'll see we will see another image, which we will interpret at somewhat greater length. But this here is the Jambu Dweep, what is called the middle world. This here, these are the seven, usually seven, sometimes they can be more, sometimes they can be less, the seven levels of hell. Heaven also has several different levels. This is the upper world here. The crescent here, you will see in the other image the meaning of this. This is an anthropomorphic representation of the Jain universe. That is, the whole world has been put inside the figure of a human being. You find that, by the way, in Hindu art too. There are some of these maps that were produced by Hindus and Jains are just absolutely breathtaking in their imagination, because the whole idea was to encompass the whole world within the figure of a human being. So you put the underworld, the middle world, the upper world, and again you will see in a different image much more clearly. But here we're moving into Jain cosmography, and then we will go back to the lives of the renouncers and their difference from the laity. Okay, their difference from the laity. So this Jain cosmology, you keep in mind this image here involves a realm of enlightened souls at the top of the universe, right? And you can read this at your leisure later on, but you have the middle world, then you have some heavenly realms, and then you have the worlds of hell, and at the very top you have the realm of enlightened souls. Okay, the realm of these enlightened souls is the world of those who have now achieved moksha. That is, that they have been able to get rid of all these karmic particles, the ones that had accumulated, and they've been able to prevent the inflow of new karmic particles. So once again, there's a discussion here of samvara, nirjara, and all of that. This is the universally accepted symbolism of the Jain faith, accepted only in 1974 on the 2500th anniversary of Mahavir's attainment of moksha. All right, so let's spend a couple of minutes there, because it tells you a lot about the faith. All right, and what is central to it. I mean, it's actually, I mean, quite remarkable in that they have been able to encapsulate a lot of the central precepts in this one image. And as I said, as far as I know, it's accepted by all Jains, all the different branches and sub branches, right? So here you get at the bottom, you get the hand, and here this word here, this is ahimsa. This is ahimsa, non-violence. So one of the central precepts, right? And the hand is the hand which is gesturing you to stop, think, be restrained. Don't rush headlong into things. All right? And this is the chakra. How many spokes are there, you think? 24. Because there are 24 Tirthankaras, right? And why the chakra? Because this is the cycle. The wheel, samsara, the wheel of birth, death, rebirth, the constant in which we are caught. Right? So this is one half. This is also, you can also think of this as divided into three parts. So this is the first part here, the base, and then you get the middle part here, and then you get the top part, and within the top part you have this over here. This is, the three dots are the Ratnatraya: right conduct, right faith, right knowledge. Straight line. If you follow this, it's a straight line. Right? This is the Siddha Lok over here, the Siddha Lok. The word of Siddhas. Siddhas are the ones who have attained enlightenment, moksha. Then you get the swastika.